Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews and to another review video here on the channel. Today we're going to be talking about A Day of Fallen Night, but I'm gonna put the cover up on screen because I have the Goldsboro edition and they're covered in plastic wrap and bad things will happen if I try and film them. Some quick disclaimers before we start. I did have a digital review copy sent to me for free for A Day of Fallen Night. However, this Goldsboro edition I bought myself. Regardless of where books come from, nobody's paying me to talk about books and all opinions are my own. I'm also going to keep this as spoiler free as humanly possible, though if you do want to go into this book knowing absolutely nothing, click away now. I'm also probably not going to spoil Priory. I think they're different enough books that you don't need to worry about it, so don't worry, we're all good. And lastly, I will link the story graph for the series below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. Now I'm going to try and check if I ever made a review video for Priory, because it was so long ago I don't remember. Apparently not. Well, that's unhelpful of me, because I really only want to talk about book 2. Suffice to say, I enjoyed Priory of the Orange Tree when I first read it. I did not reread it to read A Day of Fallen Night because this is actually a prequel. In the timeline of these books, Priory of the Orange Tree takes place beginning 1005 CE, Common Era, and this begins 500 and something, early in the 500s. So we've got about 500 years for this one. Normally I hate a prequel. We'll come on to it. We'll come on to whether I hated this prequel. Samantha Shannon's written a few things, including the Bone Season books, the first of which is getting re-released soon, and I kind of want to read it to see what the differences are, and I also kind of need to reread all of the Bone Season to make a video on it, so let me know if you would like that sooner rather than later, but it is going to come up in Overbooked soon. It's complicated. I'm a mess at the moment. Priory of the Orange Tree came out in, I think, 2019? Yes. I am a smart brain who can remember things. Day of Fallen Night came out right at the end of February of this year, 2023. These are high fantasy, epic fantasy, big chunky fantasy books. There are dragons in them. High fantasy, dragony, but not too dragony books. Let me read to you from the blurb, because me trying to summarise this will be a mess. Tanuva Milim is a sister of the Priory. For 50 years she is trained to slay worms, but none have appeared since the Nameless One, and the younger generation is starting to question the Priory's purpose. To the north, in the Queendom of Innis, Sabran the Ambitious has married the new King of Hroth, narrowly saving both realms from ruin. Their daughter Glorian trails in their shadow, exactly where she wants to be. The dragons of the east have slept for centuries. Dumai has spent her life in a Seekonese mountain temple, trying to wake the gods from their long slumber. Now someone from her mother's past is coming to upend her fate. When the Dreadmount erupts, bringing with it an age of terror and violence, these women must find the strength to protect humankind from a devastating threat. 500 years before Priory. I've already said that, but I feel like it's worth repeating. We're in a prequel. So, similar to the first book, we follow multiple different characters in this fantasy world. We see different parts of the world within that and kind of see how different things that happen in one place can impact another. It feels to me very much like Samantha Shannon wanted to write almost a history. It's not a history book in like a Tolkien kind of sense, but it does feel like documenting a period of time for various different places, more so than it feels like intentionally chasing one narrative. There is a narrative, but we're not. The framing of it is interesting. If you're looking for a big epic fantasy book to get your teeth into, this would be a great place to go. Let's answer a big question first. Do you need to read Priory to read this? I don't think so. I think it was easier reading this having read Priory, simply because you're in the right headspace for a lot of the names and the place names and the lexicon of the world. However, you could probably do that the other way around. And I think I'm right in saying Samantha Shannon said in something on Instagram at one point that Day of Fallen Night is actually probably slightly more accessible than Priory is. Just because of the writing style of it, I think. My personal feeling, my personal recommendation would be to read Priory first, but that's because I'm the kind of person who needs to read things in the order they were published or I will catch on fire. I would say if you're watching this having not read Priory, this might be a confusing review because that's where I'm coming from in it. I'm going to do a lot of comparing back and forth, but I think that's okay. So yes, big fantasy books to get your teeth into. Both of these are that. Day of Fallen Night slightly more accessible, perhaps, depending on what your particular barrier to access was. A lot of people do talk about how big these books are. They're like one of the things that people talk about when they're reading these. They're definitely long. I don't think it felt ridiculously long to me. I read about 10% of the book every day for 10 days and it didn't feel like it dragged. It didn't feel terrible. I think that's because we're jumping perspectives so much that it keeps it feeling fresh. And I managed to not lose track of the characters. I would say if you're reading it over any longer period than that, I would dedicate the time to just reading this, because I think it would be very easy to lose track of where you were if you were kind of picking this up for a few pages a day and then reading something completely different. But you know how you read best, so make that work for you. I think for me, as someone who reads very broadly, but I read quite a lot of shorter things at the moment, or that's just the pattern I've been in, it was really satisfying to sit and just read, you know, effectively, I think it's 800 and something pages. There's something that gives you a real sense of achievement about that. You really get to get into the characters. I think this is one of those books where you could cut it down to be a much more action-y book. It would be completely different, and that historical aspect wouldn't necessarily come through. I do think they'd be interesting books to reread multiple times and see which things you picked up on having read them before, but that's not something I've done yet, so I will have to get to that in the future. Another reason I love this book is I think it is even more sapphic than book one. That's not difficult to do. Book one is sapphic. I don't think it leaned into it as hard as it could have done, and book two definitely goes there, which is interesting for a prequel, because I think so often when things are particularly historical leaning fantasy, things will get more progressive, and it's interesting to see a series where they're kind of exploring different dynamics of that. Really enjoyable, really liked those aspects of it, thought it was well written. I'm excited for more other Samantha Shannon books to kind of go that same way. I just think that's going to be fun, and as a person who enjoys reading sapphic books, it worked for me. What can I say? I've written in my notes, a fun read with a lot going on. There's definitely a bunch of different threads you can follow in this. And I think for me, what works in this kind of big fantasy book is I really zero in on particular characters and plot threads that I personally care about. That's how I get through these bigger books without getting completely lost. So there was one particular character that I really got on with, and I enjoyed the reveals about his character, which did feel a little bit obviously signposted, but maybe that's not a problem. I do tend to predict these things. Another element was a particular relationship that I had a lot of investment in, and everything else kind of fell to the periphery, which is why I think rereading it, I might choose a different thing to follow and be more interested in that. That's just how I read this. There are some really great moments within the story, but weirdly, normally with a big book like this, I would just remember those moments, but my overall feeling on the book is the sense of the scope of the book, the sense of getting this really broad look at the world in this very particular time, that historical aspect to it almost, more so than I remember when this specific thing happened to this character, which is really fascinating to me, and I think it's a testament to Samantha Shannon trying to write in a slightly different, again, narrative framing. It might not work for you, but I thought it was great, and I think this is a book that so easily could have been boring and managed not to be, and I would say that as a huge accolade for the book. However, as a result of that, it isn't the most memorable story, and perhaps that again is a very personal thing of my memory tends to be of the moments rather than the overall scope. But I found that with Priory as well. I don't remember the distinct bits of Priory. I couldn't tell you the plot of Priory if you paid me, but I do remember enjoying the reading experience. And that's maybe where I would land on this, is that it's more about a reading experience than as a book as a whole. For me, interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Obviously, these are big books. If you've not got the time, the energy, the space, the capacity to read something of this size, this might not be for you. I do think they are easier to read than you would think. I think it is just about breaking it down into chunks. It's breaking it down into the bits that you want to read. I wouldn't get intimidated by how big these seem. They are not necessarily difficult just as a result of having a lot of pages. But I really wouldn't want to sit and read this all in one go. I was glad that I broke it up into chunks. I was glad that I read other things at the same time. For me personally, that just works better. I wouldn't want to, take this book on a plane. For one thing, you would have no carrying capacity left, but I wouldn't want to take it on a plane and just read it all in one go. It's not how I think it wants to be read, at least for me. I feel like other books that I would compare this to, maybe something like The Poppy War. I know that comes up a lot in recommendations for this. That's not necessarily directly similar, but that broad look at a world and actions having an impact on the world at large was definitely something that came up for me. Obviously, if you've read this and you want to read something else and you haven't read Priory, read Priory. Sapphic books that I've read recently, I've really enjoyed I've really enjoyed my reread of The Unbroken and the sequel The Faithless, which will probably be out by the time this video goes up. And I also really enjoyed The Jasmine Throne and The Early and the Sword. Great books. Really enjoyed sapphic books from the last few years. I would say if you're looking for an epic fantasy book that highlights the female characters of this world and has some really great strong female characters, is sapphic, is epic, is dragons, is a lot going on, is looking at a world really broadly, is detailed world building almost to its detriment. I think this walks the line of not having too much detail in those aspects. I think this is well worth reading. I'm going to say yes to this. I think people should read this. I don't think I would say you're not a true fantasy reader at the moment if you haven't read Priory and Day of Fallen Night, but I think they are really interesting books in this genre, and I'm excited to see what Samantha Shannon has next. I feel like that was a bit of a messy discussion about this, and I didn't really give you that much information, but hopefully you got the energy of my feelings on this book, which is that I would love to read it again. I think that's probably where I would land. Have you read this? Do you have plans to? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're down there commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also follow me on social media. You can come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I would like to say a huge thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content and live streams and more. If you would like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. So similar to book one, this is chronologies is hard.